It's Friday, May 24th. I'm Adam Walsh, and this is The Signal. 31% of folks in this province are struggling to meet basic needs. So says the latest Vital Signs report. The 2024 theme, the cost of living. I've got the folks behind it ready to break it all down for you, so don't go anywhere. And this is a Community Foundation NL and Harris Centre joint operation. Vital Signs, the province's quality of life check-in. It covers all of us. Over the course of the next hour, you'll hear about the details inside, how it was put together, and perspectives you may not have heard or thought about, or maybe you have. I'm going to read the first two paragraphs that explains this year's theme. The theme of the 2024 edition of Vital Signs is something we're all feeling. However, echoing what happened during the pandemic, we might be in the same storm, but we're in very different boats. Some may need to tap savings to cover extra costs, and others don't have a place to call home. We focused on three areas crucial to understanding the challenges to the affordability crisis: housing, food, and making a living, income and wealth. We've created regional data profiles with key local information for communities across the province and explored NL's changing population to help us chart a path forward for everyone. And that last bit, right? To help us chart a path forward for everyone, because it's a continuing conversation, much like we do here on The Signal, right? We have one show, but then we continue it with further ones. Joining me now in the studio, Kathy Newhook, Manager, Public Policy and Communications with the Harris Centre, and Nicole Dahl, Executive Director of the Community Foundation, Newfoundland and Labrador. Welcome back to the show, folks. How you doing?
Pretty good. Thanks for having us.
Good. Thank you for having us, Adam.
So my first question, and I just kind of explained it, but I want you to go into it a little bit more. Big question, why?
Why quality of life? Why
all of this for this year? Yeah, quality of life, cost of living. And yes, I read the first two paras, but give me more on it.
Well, I think a good place to start is really why Vital Signs in the first place.
Oh, that's an even better why.
Let's
I love
go
it.
bigger, Adam. The Harris Centre looks at lots of data over the course of the years, interact with lots of researchers and community organizations, and work with groups like the Community Foundation. And we're hearing a lot of different things throughout the year, and a lot of the challenge for us, and one of the key reasons that we exist, is really to take all that information that we're hearing and put it in the hands of the people who can make policy decisions and think about their communities, and who are kind of creating those solutions on the ground and giving people some insight. So the reason why we want to make sure that Vital Signs gets out there every year is to give people this really kind of bite-size bits of information in one place where they can dive in, sample a little bit of information here and there in a way that really makes sense and is easy to understand. And then they can kind of turn around and spark conversations within their own community, bring it back to their own organizations, have the discussions at the boardroom table and at the kitchen table. I use that expression all the time, because it's really that's where the rubber meets the road,
Yeah, and in every community, right, and this can be a town or just a group of folks somewhere like in this province, things can be different depending on who you ask and where you ask in terms of geography or social economic status, background, you name it. So like if a report like this were to come in, you're like, here are the solutions to everything. All of a sudden it's like, well, hold on now, but that's different for me, and that's different for my neighbor, or that's different for this community. Yeah. So to have this as, like you said, bite-sized pieces of food for thought to hopefully spark something for the conversations around solutions. It sounds great.
Yeah, it's really a tool. And so when we think about what topics we're going to cover off, because it's only a 16-page report, and we move it around. A few years ago we had one that was entirely focused on climate change, because that was an issue that really needed the deep dive on the local context of Newfoundland and Labrador. How is that hitting home here? This time around, when Nicole and I sat down and we're thinking about, how do we want to think about Vital Signs, in the next 10 years, this being the 10th year, Nicole was like, well, let's invite some more voices to the table. Let's figure out what others are really wrestling with. And the obvious choice, and the one that it doesn't make sense for us to be it to be anything else at this point in time was to be cost of living.
No, for the past year, it's just this is where we are, right? Like especially for the points that that have been mentioned for the three parts in the piece. Nicole, bringing you in this, what were your thoughts as this conversation started for who you were bringing in to try to put this thing together?
Yeah, exactly. Well, one of the really cool things with Vital Signs that a lot of folks might not know is it's actually a national initiative of the community foundations across the country. So these exist in, I think there's 60 or more of them that are all across Canada that are looking at a very local, place-based quality of life in terms of what that means. And then that really helps to guide kind of the community leadership and the investments that community foundations are doing. And we hope it's also really valuable for a lot of other folks who are trying to make sense of sort of what's happening in order to kind of move forward in a really good way. So as Kathy was saying, this year, as Vital Signs was about to turn 10, we thought, can we hold it a little bit more in community? We already had a really great partnership that was amazing that we were doing it in that kind of duality. And then we know there are a lot of folks in the province who are working really hard in both understanding this and imagining ways forward through the cost of living that really helps to support people. And so we brought a whole bunch of those folks into a room over a series of time, made sure their bellies were full, and we kind of spent some time together just talking through what it might look like. So in this, the really amazing thing is, as Kathy said, you're getting bite size, but underneath all of that, each little square, there's usually a report or someone's website or this really substantial work that you can then dive into if kind of that is the area you're wanting to understand more, whether it's about really defining the problem, because I do think that's one of the things in the cost of living. There are some really good sparks of hope in this, but a lot of it was around kind of really good, I think, sort of context and problem definition, because there is still a lot around that. A lot of the systems we're talking about have existed for a really long time, and they exist in ways that we don't always notice. And so how are we kind of bringing those kind of stories kind of above the waterline as much as possible?
I find we often talk about how complicated everything is, because a lot of stuff is really complicated. So then looking through this, some of the names that I'm looking at, they're folks who've been on the show before, and not just this show, for CBC&L and NTV, VOC, and the Telegram, all of this. It's folks who've spoken out, but and with a lot of some the similar themes. But then when you put it all together and you're like, oh, okay, wow, now I'm getting a sense of some of the issues, the complexity, some of those sparks of hope, some of the other bits of conversations, and also, like I was saying at the start of the show, perspectives that, gosh, I didn't really think about it, that way before. And that's all of that, I think, is important for what you're trying to do for helping to generate board table to kitchen table to, you name the table type of conversations. What surprised, your learning process for this? You're folks who are tapped into a lot that's going on with the community, but what was it like as you're having these conversations for what you were learning through this process?
There's always a learning process with this, and you're right in that no matter how much you're into these particular issues and you've been talking to the same sort of folks about lots of these topics for a long time, when you sit down at a table and you have those perspectives meeting, there is some really interesting kind of cross-sectional linkages that you're able to make, but I love the idea of being able to play with a bit, pulling from those different reports and the different bits of information and expertise that we have within our own community, and being able to kind of layer those for the average folks to be able to see those connections at the same time. And so, I'll give you an example. Yesterday when we had the launch and we were talking about the experiences for new immigrants in the province and the connections and the kind of challenges within the labor force and trying to figure out how we can best help people integrate into the labor force and provide, upskilling where needed and those sorts of things. We had a comment from a gentleman who does a lot of advocacy work around older workers, and he said it's important for us to have skills for older workers. And in that moment in that room, it was okay. Well, actually, when you think about what are the tools that we need for integration, for providing opportunities for new immigrants, a lot of the same kind of skills and tools and opportunities might also be beneficial for that particular group of, seniors who are out of the workforce, maybe from their first career, but looking to re-engage. And we have a labor force issue, and there's lots of labor market challenges that we have to be able to address. And so, but those two, because it's two separate groups of expertise, because there's one advocacy group that's focused on, providing opportunities for immigrants, and then there's another advocacy group that's looking at challenges for seniors. Those aren't necessarily going to meet, but they will if we talk about them in the context of vital signs, and you're pulling those bits together. And so those kind of create these nice little opportunities for thinking about the challenges a little bit differently and integrating them in a bit so that we can utilize what resources we have available, because we don't have a whole lot of resources sometimes. And so being able to kind of leverage those and maximize the resources that we do have.
Well, it's such a good example, right? Because, again, if you're to come out with, here are the solutions, it's like, wait a minute, but like now we're here and we're hearing something that like we didn't quite connect before because it's generating a conversation, right? So about seniors in this province, with our demographic issues, with also the cost of living issues that folks are having, and then just maybe there's some upskilling here, some training here, because from the other lens for newcomers. I mean, because I never thought about that before.
Yeah, I mean, the other piece about, not to dwell on the seniors and new immigrants too long, but the one of the other pieces of information that we put in Vital Signs this year was about how a lot of newcomers to the province are experiencing far greater rates of loneliness and kind of disconnection to their place. And of course, we all know that plays a huge role in retention. No one's going to stick around if they don't feel connected to the place. And for those of us who've, grown up here and have family connections here and, deal with the miserable weather, we do it because we have a connection to the place. We see ourselves through the hard times because we have a connection to place. And so if we're expecting and hoping that people were going to come to the province and stick around, then how are we building those connections? But seniors are another group that also experience a lot of loneliness and isolation. And so, we're talking about two separate issues: labor market involvement, jobs, cost of living, but also talking about how people work and live together and have a connection to place. And so again, two different populations, two completely separate issues. But when you think about it, when you're looking at it in a 16-page, easy to read newspaper kind of document, not a heavy-duty report where you have to have some kind of expertise to dig in, those are the sorts of things that come to light as really kind of low-hanging fruit ways that we can figure out how to work better together.
It is easy to read, right? Because the number of times at work as a journalist, you get reports and oh gosh, I got to try to thumb my way through. But this, because you've got some picture things there, and little bite-sized bits, but with that, it gives you so much great information. And you mentioning stats, right? Like I said again at the beginning of the show, that it was also on the CBC headline yesterday, 31, right? So if Newfoundland and Labrador was a community of just 100 people, 31 would have difficulty financially meeting basic needs like transportation, housing, food, clothing, and other necessary expenses. Like you said, 13 who feel lonely, 20 experiencing housing insecurity, 24 over the age of 65. The rural to northeast Avalon split 40 to 42. 51 who feel they have excellent or very good mental health. each one of these stats really says something, and so that is it's so important. I think too, like the role that statistics play with this piece, and this is the Stats Lab, right, with Jamie Ward in the crowd.
Yeah, so RANLab, we're really lucky to have such a great resource at our fingertips at the Harris Center. So the Regional Analytics Lab is a very small group of staff who are able to kind of pull in, dig into the statistics that a lot of people can have access to. But I mean, if you've ever been on the StatsCan website, it's better now than it used to be, but it's still really hard to dig in and understand what the heck you're looking at.
Oh yeah, I can't.
And anytime I've ever had a question where I've been trying to actually, get to some deeper information than what they spit out in their news releases or their kind of daily, which are updates, which are great. I get a data file and I'm just lost in like thousands of indicators in little boxes in a spreadsheet, and it's a long learning process to figure out which way's up on that thing. And so Jamie Ward at the Harris Center RANLab is able to kind of pull those things and point us in the right direction, and then also be a really nice, good guiding hand to redirect sometimes when I get excited about numbers and he says, actually, Kathy, if you dig down, this doesn't really represent, and what you really need is to look at this specific thing, or you can't. His famous one is, you can't do that math. That math doesn't work that way, Kathy. And so we have many of those conversations around the table, and it's a learning process. But I also love the fact that we can get to a point where we can pull out these numbers and really kind of stand behind and say, you know what, it's not a survey that we asked, just a handful of people. This is really this is from the census. This is, household based. We can be strong and confident in the fact that we know that these numbers are an accurate representation of what the province looks like. Of
the communities across Newfoundland and Labrador. I mentioned we're going to get some perspectives through the show of folks who are part of Vital Signs this year. One of them is a business prof, Tom Cooper, who is on the line right now. Hi, how you doing?
Hi, Adam. Hi, everyone.
So, homes or investment? How we think about home ownership. What happens when we look at homes as investments?
When we start to look at homes as investments, then money starts to flow into that market, and people start to buy multiple units and try to develop a reasonable return on investment. And what that means is that constricts the supply that's available for people who may be underhoused or basically don't have the amount of money to pay for someone's, not only their mortgage but also and their bills, but also to generate a reasonable return on investment. Now, we live in a world where we live in a mixed capitalist economy, and there's nothing wrong with looking at houses as an investment, but it's kind of and most of this work has been done by my awesome PhD student, Hope Jameson, and others. But it's just looking, once again, almost from a normative standpoint, is this a good thing, or is this a challenge, et cetera? And how do we develop different models of housing and different opportunities for people who don't necessarily want to be living in those types of accommodation and or don't have the financial wherewithal to actually afford the rent, because people are trying to make a pretty good return on investment because they need it for their pension or they just need it for their own income.
So how hard is it to kind of even all of this out from the way we've been used to, for a lot of folks, thinking about homes as just investments and money makers as opposed to home for shelter, and finding some kind of a balance that works for all of us?
Yeah, totally. And it's a really great question, and I'm really glad the Harris Center and Vital Signs asked me to contribute to this, because this is something that's not really, in the whole spectrum of the last 100 years, it's not something that just emerged 100 years ago, but at the same time, it's not something emerged overnight. This is, I would say, is maybe a phenomenon of the last 30, 40 years, and maybe even less so in Newfoundland, whereby people instead of putting the money necessarily in the stock market or putting in a bank and looking for GIC, they're buying houses because houses are seen to be more stable. They're being more generating a better return on investment, et cetera. And moving, that also means that how we think about home ownership changes as well. So as someone, I lived a lot of my adult life, or beginning of my adult life, over in the UK, and in Europe, and in different parts of Europe, home ownership is just not something people do. Germany has a very small percentage of home ownership in comparison to other jurisdictions in Europe. And when I lived in London in the UK, I was used to say one of the most easy conversations you could have with someone was, what do you think of the housing market? Where do you see the investment opportunities? And this is how we almost conversed with each other. When that becomes the norm, that one becomes the expectation, when we start to look at housing not as a human right, not as a basic need, but instead of something, how can I generate enough money so I can hit Freedom 55 or retire even early, then we start to get into a whole bunch of difficult policy decisions, as well as philosophical and normative and rights-based issues as well.
So who do you think now, should take these these ideas, and where should they go? Like, where should the conversation head, and who should be having this conversation around this different look from what home ownership has become?
Yeah, and I think a lot of that dialogue has already happened, Adam, whether we've seen it in terms of the discussion around the encampment down by Colonial Building. I know one of the organizations that I'm involved in, and Homelessness St. John's, has been excellent in promoting that dialogue and having that conversation. Part of it's beyond the dialogue, is just going to be, what can we expect for the future? And this is where I just got back from Toronto, where I was at a family wedding, and when I look at the housing prices in Toronto, even versus here, even as someone who's a well-paid university professor, getting on the property market in Toronto would be almost impossible. Yeah. And from your time when you were living over in Tokyo, once again, housing is crazy in terms of proportion of your income. Do we live in a world where we just expect to be renters? What is home ownership? Home ownership is great, but do we have to look at things from a different perspective? And moreover, do we put boundaries then, as we've seen in some jurisdictions in Canada, about who can buy houses as investments and how many houses you can part of your portfolio? But then again, that kind of comes up against the usual market-based systems that we have. So there's a whole bunch of policy issues. There's a bunch of like I mentioned, almost ethical issues that we have to think about. And what the Harris Center and Vital Signs has really come out is saying, yeah, let's start to have this dialogue. Let's start to have this discussion, and let's figure out maybe what are some of the different paths forward, because the model that we have now is arguably getting unsustainable, and probably is unsustainable, especially when we look at prices of housing versus income being the average income that most people have. Professor Tom Cooper, thank you so much, as always, for coming on the show. Okay, thank you, Adam. Thanks, everyone. Have a great day and have a great weekend. Cheers. You too. Business Prof. Tom Cooper there. You're listening to The Signal. I'm Adam Walsh. We are digging into the latest Vital Signs, and this one's on the cost of living. Here with me in the studio, we've got Nicole Dahl, Executive Director of the Community Foundation of Newfoundland and Labrador, Kathy Newhook, Manager of Public Policy and Communications with the Harris Center. Nicole, we'll go to you. Just thoughts on what the good professor was saying?
Yeah, I think I really like the piece that we have there from Tom, partly because there is a lot to notice from a larger policy decision, but I even think in our own everyday lives, and not to necessarily notice with judgment, but to notice with a lot of curiosity. So even when we think about our own homes, so when we're making certain decisions, are we making that for a home, or are we making that as an investment? And even taking stock of how often we may be in one of those cases, and then just seeing those trends maybe a little bit more clearly in policy decisions, or in trends that we're maybe seeing in the world. Because there is this, we talk a lot, and definitely should talk a lot, about sort of how we, have sufficient incomes, but there is also a piece of, we always seem to keep seeing the kind of floor and ceiling of incomes still beginning further apart, even when we see incomes come. So there's more around how do we look at sort of the ceiling of some of that. So we're actually bringing things potentially a little bit closer together. And so you'll see that both in what Tom kind of brought forward, or in some of the stuff that Food First is talking about that's come forward with their living and lived advisory group in terms of we also have to be looking at like, should we be depending on the market entirely to the extent that we do for basic needs like food and housing? Do we need a better, different mix of that? Because as Tom said, it is at an unsustainable point, and we really need to look at some of those underlying structural pieces that we have in those systems too.
And like you said, it's not a judgment thing. It's a, hey, let's look at how stuff is working, have a conversation thing. So like how many properties should folks be able to buy is perhaps a good question. And then if we end up living in a spot where more folks are renting, then should there be caps on this or shouldn't there be? All of these are important discussions because of the communities that we live in, and it's how the folks are living in them and being able to afford or not in these communities. And I will say, just Wednesday this week, we had the home builders in talking about where we are with that whole stat of we need, 6,000 units a year, which they're like, that's not possible. The most we've ever done is 2,400. We might be able to do that if we're lucky. But again, interesting conversation to be had around housing and supply and where we are. So that's on YouTube. If you want to go back and watch it, everyone, all the shows are put up every afternoon. Let's go to another perspective first. We heard from Tom Cooper there, right? Memorial University business prof. Now let's go to Jillian Pearson, childcare researcher and advocate, who's on the line. Hi, Jillian. Welcome back to the show.
Oh, hi, Adam.
Under making a living, the economics of care. Why is access to care so important?
Well, our society and our economy has progressed where it does require two incomes in a two-income family, and that means for families who have children that most parents will have to return to work shortly after they finish up maternity or parental leave. And if we don't have solid childcare infrastructure within a particular region, then that has really big impacts on a family's ability to return to the workforce. And the research shows as well that generally that has a disproportionate impact on women. They are usually the ones that if they don't have access to the childcare, then they can't return to their work.
Right, so it disproportionately affects women. It's more complex for women. And we've talked before about childcare in this province. So we've gone through more subsidization, a service meant to help, but then we end up in this spot where, okay, it's fine if you have a spot, but there's not enough spaces, there's not enough staff, and this is where we are. I'm just wondering if you could kind of go into that a little bit further.
That's right. So when a government tries to address childcare issues, you really have to address it holistically, or what we see has happened in Newfoundland and Labrador is that, when you are taking on the affordability piece, that really puts pressure on the supply because then more people can afford the childcare to get back to work. And then if you don't have the workforce to match the demand, then you're creating childcare deserts, or you're creating a lot of pressure on the system and on the families. So we did see this happen in Quebec. They were one of the first provinces to introduce affordable rates for childcare. So when you go about it in a disjointed way, addressing the childcare system, especially when you have a mixed public-private system. So you have, some private providers, some not-for-profits, some provinces even have public providers. And you're not driving it in a supply-side model. You're just, leaving it up to demand. Then that means that there are all kinds of discrepancies in terms of affordability and availability.
Thoughts on either the conversation needed to start to get out of this, or thoughts on just how we kind of get out of this?
So, it's difficult to change a system quickly when you cannot remove parts of that system, or by removing parts of that system or drastically changing it, then it affects people's access to childcare in the short term. So that is the biggest challenge. Is it's difficult to transform the system without displacing spaces. So really, you have to kind of attack these things all at once in terms of the labor force, as well as the infrastructure, and as well as the training. So all those pieces go together. But if there isn't, say, intense political will to solve this quickly, then a lot of these things tend to happen in slow motion.
Yeah, it gums up the system. It's just like, hey, it's cheaper for everyone. Well, guess what? We don't have enough spots. Or also, there's a big discussion happening around how much early childhood educators should make, whether or not there should be benefits about the training, how they should be looked at as professionals as opposed to in the past as babysitters, all of that type of stuff, right?
Yeah, for sure. And I mean, most of these issues, they've been around for quite some time. Yeah. They really were brought to the forefront, 5 or 6 years ago about the transformation that was needed in the system to build, a stronger, more resilient system all across the province, especially in rural areas where we have the biggest deserts. But there really wasn't any close attention paid to it until we were really deep into COVID. And a lot of other institutions realized how important childcare was to the rest of society.
Gillian Pearson, we'll have to leave it there. Thank you, as always, for coming on the show.
Thanks.
Gillian Pearson there, childcare researcher and advocate who has a piece or info in the latest Vital Signs for 2024. Go back to Kathy Newhook now. Thoughts on what Gillian was saying?
Yeah, so many thoughts. Thank you, Gillian, as always. I think she hit on one of the points where, about the challenge of fixing this particular situation. And I think it's even broader than just the childcare. So she talked about how right now we have a need for a big policy transformation. There's a big transformation needed in how we think about care and paid care and providing care. And we have really old systems that have graduated into our current environment. Our current systems were not designed for what our families look like right now. We have 2 working parents. Women are in the workforce. The systems we have in place were never designed for that. Yeah. They were designed for women to be at home doing the care work for free. And our economy was based on women at home doing care for free, men at work, earning the income. And that shifted to require women to work, but also, obviously, women want to be able to work.
Both, all of that.
That's silly now.
Yeah.
But we still have, schools, for example, we have schools that are designed for education, and that's important. And obviously, we want to have schools for education, but their schools are being used really as a way of as daycare, in many ways. And schools are 9 to 3. And who works from 9 to 3? I don't know anybody who works from 9 to 3. Lucky people, maybe. And so it's not a sufficient way to look at the education system is not a sufficient way to look at daycare or childcare. And so, but we have a system in place for that. So why don't we have a system for daycare? And why aren't those 2 systems integrated in any way that really makes sense from a policy perspective? But it requires so much change. Yeah. And the so much change means a lot of resources need to go in because, like Gillian said, you can't take away things while you're adding things. And you can't add the things until you've taken away things. So you have a real catch-22 of requiring double the resources for a little while until you figure out what this new system is going to look like and shake out all the bugs. And I think we faced that same kind of catch-22 policy challenge in lots of different areas. Healthcare. I'm not going to get into healthcare today, but that's another area where, in order to shift how we do that, we need to double up on some of the resources. Well, we don't have the money to double up on any of those resources now. And so it's a really hard problem.
At a time when we're reimagining, not to get into healthcare, but it's like at a time when we are reimagining healthcare systems and how it works, when we're trying to reimagine education systems and how they work, then we're talking about childcare as well. And all of this around things like social determinants of health, cost of living, and how communities function in order to live okay and maybe thrive.
One of the other things she said is the fact that those are hard political decisions. And I think that's where tools like Vital Signs and the advocacy work that community organizations can do, not in pushing the political agenda necessarily, but informing the citizens about what the actual problems are. And so our ability to be able to scope the issue really well so that people can understand what those challenges are, so they're not getting mad about teachers not working after 3 o'clock, because that's silly. They're educated as a teacher, not a daycare provider. It's a different skill set. Let's not pretend that it's the same. But if people aren't thinking about those things, if they're not puzzling in their head about how housing ownership looks and why do we own homes as investments, doesn't that make more sense as a right rather than an investment? And if they're not thinking about those things, then how can we expect politicians or our policymakers to be able to make those challenging choices and put in place those challenging decisions without kind of an informed citizenry that can really be on side with understanding there's going to be some pains in that growth process. So that's one of the things that I really hope that people are able to kind of take away from this stuff.
Yeah, informed opinions as opposed to just truthiness, I think, as Steve Colbert said years ago. We've got Maria Gentle on the line, Executive Director of the YWCA. Hi.
Hello, Adam. How are you?
Good. How you doing on this rainy St. John's Day?
Don't get me started on the weather. I'm just really happy to be part of the conversation with Vital Signs. Congrats to Kathy and the Harris Center and Nicole at Community Foundation. And we got to be such part of such a great group of organizations to be part of this. So let's talk about that.
Tell us about your input on it now.
Sure. So YWCA St. John's, we run a number of initiatives that consider gender equity, particularly around economic security, and that includes employment, newcomer services, and financial empowerment. And when we talk about our focus on gender equity, we look at an intersectional lens, and that really means we're considering women and gender diverse folks and those marginalized by race and immigration status, which so much of that really came up through that conversation in this report.
So then tell me about the wage gap and what you found out.
Well, there's so much great work being done on gender equity and wage gap, particularly through the St. John's Status Council of Women. And I really think this sits well to follow up on the conversation on the economy of care and really looking at the value we place on paid and unpaid labor and the social and material care that's provided, because we know this is gendered. And it's so essential. And as your previous guest mentioned, when the pandemic hit, we know that the economy just really can't run without care from nurses like childcare and education. And so that's not only because of the pay gap, but that these roles and the roles of women and gender diverse folks continue to be undervalued. And so when we contributed to the report in collaboration with the St. John's Status Council of Women, we really looked at why the numbers look like they do. And when we look at low wage work and how it impacts women, gender diverse folks, and those marginalized by race and immigration, it's not just individual fault, but it's really cross-cutting discrimination that can be addressed through social policy. And I think the challenge here as we have this conversation is not to pit people or groups against each other, but to consider we are part of a really wealthy nation. Yeah. And how can we leverage some of this wealth so that people are not in need.
Minimum wage.
Yes.
And the thought around folks who are on social assistance. There's a
Right.
part in there on that. Can you explain that and what? Because it mentions folks being stuck on social assistance, and then with a hard look at where minimum wage is set.
That's right. And so we've had some excellent collaboration, like I said, with the St. John Status Council of Women. And the YWCA is really proud to be part of First Voice, which is the Urban Indigenous Coalition to Advance Reconciliation. And we're really in support of basic income and the view that people have a basic right to live in dignity with a basic minimum standard of living and economic support, right? So we know through a number of reports, particularly there's one through the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives that look at minimum wage across the province and how there's such a gap between the current minimum wage and what it really takes to survive. And so we support measures that can raise and reduce that gap so that, like I said, people can live in dignity and overcome some of this hardship. Because, what happens when people, and particularly these people, women are marginalized by economic insecurity at a greater rate than others, that it becomes harder and harder to come out of poverty over time. And so, measures include increase to minimum wage, basic income, as well as employment and social support. So supports can be there, but it takes more policy to get people up and out and to recover.
Maria Gentle, thank you for taking time during your lunch hour for coming on the show again.
It's a pleasure. And I think that the real key here is to consider how we can work together and to consider, when we look at the economy, particularly when we think about retention and immigration as it impacts our province, that we consider what people need to live well. And that's really the social determinants of health and how economy really is part of people's well-being and the driving forces to people staying. And I'm really excited about the work that the YWC does to support newcomers in particular, to be part of a vital community. And I think this report, the Vital Signs, really, highlights that as well and what we need to do to work together.
And there's a rumor there might be some sun tomorrow for you. So enjoy it and enjoy your weekend. Thanks again.
Thanks, Adam. Thank you.
Maria Gentle there, Executive Director at YWCA St. John's. You are listening to The Signal. We're talking about vital signs today. Nicole Daw, Executive Director of the Community Foundation of Newfoundland and Labrador. Thoughts on what Maria was just saying?
Yeah, so much. Just great perspectives that Maria was able to bring forward. And again, this was the piece that in Vital Signs that she's referencing was in partnership with the St. John Status of Women Council. And that snippet actually came out of a joint minimum wage submission that I think 7 or 8 kind of nonprofits and charities across the province had put together, which also referenced another piece that I think is really great if folks are wanting to learn a little bit more about universal basic income, which is another thing as we think about economic security and the possible policy decisions we can make around exploring what could be next. First Voice and First Light have a really great policy brief, which might sound a little bit like, but it's actually written, I think, really well and in a lot of plain language that someone can read it. And it gives examples of what that could look like in a lot of different ways, because I think that word gets thrown around a lot and people have assumptions about what it could mean. But universal basic income exists in different places in different ways. And you can make different decisions about how it might show up in your community. So it's a great read. And yeah, just again, those things that I think we really need to notice, and also really notice who is sometimes involved in conversations about these sort of things, because I think so much of that with Vital Signs was a really important piece for that. And we have more to do, I think, to expand who is sort of shaping this. But I think we did a great job in terms of bringing more voices around the table to bring those different perspectives and kind of leaning into more of that collective wisdom formed by a really large range of sort of diverse thinkers and expertise to sort of help to bring it forward. And I think that's been part of the magic with this report, and also with that sort of minimum wage submission that a whole bunch of us did too.
And again, the three categories, right? Making a living, housing. So we've had voices on both of those today. The other one is on food. And here on this show, we've done a fair bit on food insecurity. Just last week, May 16th, we did a show titled Changing Food Charity in Emergency Food Systems. So that was with Josh Mee from Food First NL, Haiti Poudan, who's with the Lived and Living Experience Advisory Group, Alison Hollahan with the East End Food Banks Coalition for the McSheffrey Resource Center. We're going to be doing another show on this in a couple of weeks. So the conversation continues, but sticking on that food bit, and you can always tell when I'm like pulling out like something, whether it's a book or in this case vital signs. One thing that really stood out we were talking up in the newsroom about this, right? And we're going to do this. We've got a little project we're going to do around it, but I'll tell you folks more about it later. But the part that stood out, what's for supper, right? Climbing cost of common family recipes. A pot of beef stew and a simple vanilla cake to share with family and friends costs about 41% more in 2024 than it did just 5 years ago.
Yeah, this is a big one.
It's so simple. And beef stew alone is 43% more. So 2019, a pot of beef stew, and yes, this depends on where you live in the province, but $15.37. 2024, $22.04. Like, this is where we are for affordability when it comes to food. And I know everyone's like, oh, we know prices have gone up, but I just think it's like, when you look through and you see something like that, it really speaks to some of this, the cost of living issue that folks are experiencing. How does this kind of thing end up in here, and what's the conversation like around putting it in?
This piece in particular, we can't take entire credit for this because we hired a co-op student, Fahim, and I wish I knew his last name. Give him a nice shout out. But he's been doing some really interesting work with Jamie and the crew at RanLab, looking at the scanner data. So this is unlike the rest of the information. Most of the rest of the information is coming right from StatsCan. A lot of it is coming from the census. This actually is coming right from scanner data.
Wow.
That we have access through. I'm pretty sure it's through StatsCan. Anyway, but it's very minute data. So we're able to look at if you went to the grocery store. And again, like sales, you can shop sales. This doesn't take that into account. But he actually can take all of the ingredients. So anything you buy in the grocery store, it comes in. You actually can get this printout of what does the cost actually at the end of the day for different places, and so he has all this done in a really neat system where you can plug in ingredients to see what the cost has been for those particular ingredients over the course of however long they've been collecting this data. So we have 5 years here. And one of the questions we had around the table, just chatting about this neat new program that Fahim had developed, was, well, geez, like, how much does it cost, like, for a particular meal? Like, can we plug recipes in here? We got really excited about, like, what we can do with this little data portal. And so a colleague of mine, Leslie, put together a recipe for cake. And it's like, this is a basic vanilla cake. Yeah. So, like, you could even call it a duff because it doesn't have icing. And so I figure if it doesn't have icing, it's not real cake. And so looking at the recipe and what's the change over time. And I thought, well, geez, like, that makes sense because I'm going to the grocery store and it really hurts. Yeah. And I just had this thought of, like, we sit around the table and sharing meals together is such an important piece of our culture, and it's lots of cultures, obviously, but it's an important piece of connection and how we experience community together and meals as a family. And I thought, how are the nans and pops handling all of this increase in food? Because their income is really set. Yeah. And they're still inviting us over for supper. I was invited over for supper. I couldn't make it because I was sick, and it was delivered to my house. Thank you, in-laws. And they're still making those meals. And so something as simple as a vanilla cake and a pot of beef stew, that is as basic as let's feed the crowd who's coming over, like, you know, you just got in from a cold day in the woods or whatever, out in the rain and disgustingness that's happening outside today. You warm up to a pot of beef stew, but darn, that's way more expensive now than it's ever been before. And so that's just one of those numbers that enables us to really make it concrete and hit home for people. They've been feeling it all along, so it's almost just validating what we've all been experiencing in a way that's not arguable.
No.
You know, it's like, okay, well,
It's
your
there.
bill is different. You shop with the coupons, and maybe you get to go to Costco, and you can buy in bulk, and you can't, and whatever. And we're all experiencing it a little bit differently. But when it boils down to it, pun not intended, it's tough.
Yeah.
And 43% for a pot of stew. It's not an elaborate meal.
Over 5 years, right? And
Yeah.
for both, and if you've got the pairing, right? And you talk about that, you sit down for the stew and the cake, 41% over 5 years for costs, and then you think of everything else you're laying out, right? Like the transportation costs, it's like home insurance costs. Are you still on oil heat? Have you been able to switch over yet? Like all of that is in your head for where we are. Plus everything else that's in this report, and plus region-specific information too.
Yeah, it's tough. And like incomes have not changed. That was another one of the items that we pulled out. You know, incomes have really, comparable incomes have actually gone down in the province in the last 5 years.
Nicole, what else stands out to you? Like we've covered a lot, right, over the course of the last 50 minutes or so. What else from this has kind of stood out for you or spoken to you from the Vital Signs report?
Yeah, well, I think one of the things that we didn't get to chat, we talked a little bit about, but one of the sections is really also considering the population change in the province. And Kathy did a great job of unpacking this yesterday at the report launch, but we've had the same kind of story around population in the province for a long time. Outmigration, you know, not as many people being born, older population, all of these sorts of pieces, which is still true. But in these last few years, with largely driven by sort of international migration and a little bit of sort of having more people coming into the province than kind of going, as Kathy says, coming home to kind of Newfoundland instead of out to Alberta. We're seeing that shifting, and so I think there's a lot for us to sort of to consider there around how we're kind of rethinking some of those systems, because a lot of what, and you'll see this from some folks, and Constanza, who's the founder with Newfoundlander and also Newbornlander, and was with Task Force NL, like does a great job of talking about all the small things that can sort of add up in that journey, and just both I think including more people who really understand those small things in terms of how we shape things as employers and as policy, but also just being more aware of what those small things can be, because I know any of us can appreciate sometimes at the end of a day that thing that might happen, I don't know, like someone being late or dinner burning or who knows what can happen, like is not that really big of a thing. But if it was a day that you had 4, 5, 6, 7 things go wrong, that can feel like a lot. And so that's the same thing that can happen with a lot of folks when they're kind of immigrating in the province, and whether they're having this place chosen for them or they are choosing this place, there's a lot more that we can be doing as individuals and employers, and just in general policy, to be really ensuring that folks are able to decide that they want to call this place home. Not that everyone also needs to do that, but I think we could be doing more so that folks are like, I do feel like valued and like I belong here.
Yeah, the range there. So Laura Umba, who's also in this, one time was on the show and talked about just, you know, checking in with folks. If something is happening, you know, if it's a diaspora thing that's happening, if it's a culture thing that's happening, actually, if it's a workplace or a friendship thing, checking in with folks. And then Constanza last time, Safatle, who was on the show, and Tony Fang was on The Economist. On the other end of that, it's like, hey, newcomers, insurance for cars is super expensive, and perhaps that should change, or it needs to be looked at, because it is a barrier to folks living in rural parts of the province, and also for sticking around here. So, I mean, these are some of the ranges that's in the pages of Vital Signs, really. So, which I find really interesting. We got 30 seconds. Where does it go from here? I kind of said it in the beginning. You've all said it too. But where do we go from here with this?
Well, we really want to get people to keep kind of talking about this. So we've done a lot of talking this week. We are very happy to have folks continue that conversation. We can come to you and help you sort of host that or unpack the report, or we'll have some things that are kind of going to be coming through the rest of the year to, again, give more nuance. There's a lot in 16 pages, but also it's not a lot to really kind of add the texture and the nuance and sort of the community curiosity and compassion that we need to have in these conversations to figure out how we are making today sort of better, because we need that, but then also really being more kind of bold and imaginative about what the future can be too.
Kathy, 15 seconds. Any final thought?
Yeah, pick up a copy and dive in. If we'll have them in the libraries next week, community hubs around the province. Call us. We'll send you a stack. Share it with your friends and family.
Nicole Daw and Kathy Newhook, thank you so much, folks. Talking about vital signs there, so do check it out. There's a lot of interesting information. That is it for today's show. Monday, hey, I always sent a photo of a bunch of refrigerators in a dumpster waiting to be recycled. The question being, could these not have been repaired for a longer life? Monday's show is about the right to repair. We're going to explain it. You'll hear how it can empower consumers, support competition, help the environment. You'll also hear about what we get wrong when it comes to e-waste and why the words reduce and reuse are really important. But that's Monday. We'll have a weekend in between. Cheers.